Last July, the government controversially announced a cut to the winter fuel payment for pensioners. Now, ministers have confirmed most people will get it back again. We will be discussing that and what happened when Greta Thunberg and other activists tried to deliver aid on a boat to Gaza in this episode of the BBC's daily news podcast, Newscast. Hello, it is Alex in the studio.
And it is Chris at Westminster.
So, Chris, a few weeks ago, Adam was talking to the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, and you might remember that she said this.
Are you going to look at expanding the scope of who can claim the winter fuel payment?
Well, look, when I became Chancellor, I think that most people recognise that we faced a pretty tough inheritance and we had to take some urgent decisions in the first month of taking office to ensure that our public finances were in a stable position, because I made a commitment that I would never repeat the mistakes that Liz Truss made, which crashed our economy and sent mortgage rates soaring. I do understand the concerns that people have. We did increase the basic state pension, the new state pension, by over £450 just last month in April. We have put £25 billion into the NHS, which disproportionately is used by older people. But I will continue to listen to understand the concerns that people have raised. We are a government that listens, but we would always need to show where the money was going to come from if we're going to make any policy changes. So that would be part of any normal process.
So that was Rachel Reeves talking to Adam a couple of weeks ago when she was saying we're a government that listens. So sort of suggesting that maybe they were going to make a move on winter fuel. Then a couple of days after that, the Prime Minister stood up at Prime Minister's Questions and basically confirmed that more pensioners were going to get it. Then there was this period where we didn't know which pensioners, how many pensioners, who, how much. And then today we've had the detail, finally.
Yeah, that's right, Alex. So, I mean, what we've had with this is, as you were mentioning there, really, we've had this sort of announcement of a U-turn in multiple stages. The hint to Adam, the words from the Prime Minister, but without any of the detail that really mattered. There was even a bit of confusion for a while about whether or not it would kick in this coming winter or the one after. But it was only today that we actually have been able to answer the question, you know, if you were previously a recipient of the winter fuel payment and then last winter you were not, will you get it this winter or will you not? And the answer is, if you have an income of £35,000 in a year or less, you will receive the payment automatically this winter. If it's higher than that, here's the little twist. You will still get it, but it'll be taxed back from you, or you might have to register it on a tax form if that's how you sort out your taxes. And we can get into it, but I'm going to make sure I dig it out so I get the exact specifics right. There is particular quirks if you are a pensioner couple and one of you receives more than 35,000 and the other receives less. And then there's twists as well in Scotland and Northern Ireland, because the winter fuel payment is an England and Wales policy. There are knock-ons for Scotland and Northern Ireland who have similar but different schemes, which are a little, well, different as well as being similar, and therefore it's not an immediate read across.
It's so interesting because when the government first signalled that it was going to do something to move on winter fuel after all of the consternation that had been raised about the original decision to take it away from pensioners, there were a lot of people saying, aha, but the problem is it's really complex. Like, in order to find a method or a vehicle within the Treasury or DWP or tax system or whatever it might be, to try and find a way that more people will get it, but it won't return to a full universal payment so everyone gets it. It's just going to be really complicated. And just what you were saying there outlines some of the complexity that's even going to be in this new system. But what also struck me was that when Adam was talking to Rachel Reeves about this, what she was really clear on then a few weeks ago was, if we're going to do it, we're going to have to say how we pay for it. And as far as I can ascertain, we're still waiting to hear how the government's going to pay for it, right?
Yeah, we are absolutely waiting to hear. And I don't think we will hear until the budget in the autumn. Now, the Chancellor, I spoke to her and she said, look, she's absolutely wedded to her fiscal rules. So she's absolutely keen to make the argument that she remains as assiduous as she would see it in the management of the public finances, as she always was. And by the way, I should mention that, last summer when this announcement was first made, back at the end of July, Rachel Reeves had only been Chancellor for a handful of weeks. You could really tell. I know there's been an argument ever since about, the size of the black hole and whether Labour were overcooking it, etc., etc. Just on a human level, you could absolutely see in Rachel Reeves and her team a sense of real concern about the numbers that they had inherited and what that might mean for financial stability, and could you end up with a situation where the markets get wobbly, etc., etc. They really felt like they had to do something and do something quickly. So they had to find something known as in year. So a lot of changes a Treasury would make could be big, but they might not kick in straight away. They felt they had to find something that could kick in straight away. They picked winter fuel because it would kick in straight away. They found a threshold that would save them quite a lot of money and was quite clear, which was pegging it to pension credit. The argument made at the time to me and others was if we'd picked another threshold, A, we wouldn't have saved as much, and B, it would be more complicated. And this arguably is more complicated and clearly saves a lot less money. But I just, in the interests of fairness around this whole row, and critics see it as the biggest debacle of Labour's first year in office, back then when they made the call, rightly or wrongly, they really felt like they had to do something and do something quite significant. I mean, granted, it's come with a lot of political heat, but they felt that they had to act.
You mentioned there that you've been talking to the Chancellor today about all of the details of this, including how they were going to pay for it and what the consequences of this decision might mean for future economic choices. We can have a little listen to some of what Rachel Reeves said to you a little bit earlier, Chris.
Chancellor, do you wish you'd done what you're announcing today in the first place? And will you apologise to those pensioners who you've messed around over the last year?
I had to make urgent decisions last year to put the public finances back on a firm footing after inheriting a £22 billion black hole in year in the public finances.
You had to do it.
We had to make a number of difficult decisions on welfare, on tax and spending, but we have returned a stability to the economy. The most recent numbers show that we were the fastest growing economy in the G7 in the first quarter of this year, and we have listened to what people have said about the level of the means test, which is why this year 9 million pensioners will receive the winter fuel payment.
So that was you, Chris, talking to Rachel Reeves. But there's a lot of detail and a lot of complexity, as we've mentioned. And I think it's probably fair to say that some of this might emerge in coming days. But one of the questions that you raised and one of the questions that people are asking is this like a household payment or is this individuals? I.e., if you're in a couple where one of you has an income of less than the new £35,000 threshold, but one of you has an income of more, does that mean that you'll get it or not? And I was listening to Paul Johnson from the Institute for Fiscal Studies, who happened to be on Newscast with Laura on Sunday. And he was on the PM programme on Radio 4. And he was saying that his understanding at this stage, and of course this might change if we get more clarity from government, but his understanding at this stage was that this is a payment that will go through kind of individual income. So that does mean that if you're in a couple where one of you has an income of, say, £100,000, but one of you has an income of £34,000 below the threshold, you would now get the winter fuel payment. But if you were in a couple where both of you have an income of, say, £36,000, like just over the threshold, you won't get it. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, in other words, it can be quite messy, can't it? And individuals could find themselves in the whole business. If you're above the threshold and you don't use this new mechanism they're going to dream up where you can say, I don't qualify, therefore don't send me it. You could end up in a bit of an administrative thing. The government argues for some it'll be simple, for others perhaps less so, of the whole business of giving it back.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I remember that when George Osborne used a sort of similar mechanism, which was about child benefit, and he wanted to limit child benefit for higher earners, he used a similar thing, which was like a claw back through the tax system. And a similar thing arose at that time about what that would mean for households where perhaps both people earn just less under the threshold, and then, or versus higher income households where one of you earns less and one of you earns more, and all of the various complexities with it. And the other element to this, of course, as you said, this is England and Wales, but the systems will be different in Scotland and Northern Ireland, because after the government's decision to remove the winter fuel payment in the first place, the devolved government started sort of doing their own thing a little bit, right?
Yeah, and so we've had a bit of reaction already from, say, the Scottish government. They say they felt that they were left in the dark. They didn't know that this was coming, that they weren't consulted on it. They and Northern Ireland have their own schemes, but then there are consequences as a result of the government at Westminster making a change in this kind of space. They're known as Barnett consequentials. And so over time, so there will be a consequence of all of this, out of which the governments in Belfast and Edinburgh will be able to react because they will have some more money to play with. So this is likely to have implications for pensioners all around the UK, but with a little twist that it's a little different in Scotland and Northern Ireland.
It strikes me that, the government clearly felt like it had no option but to move on this. And there had been a lot of unhappiness on the Labour backbenches about it, but particularly in light of the local election results in May, and then also the loss of what was a Labour seat in Runcorn and Helsby to Reform UK. The feedback seemed to be pretty clear from Labour MPs, from actually people in the cabinet who recognised that this issue was really coming up on the doorstep and doing some damage to Labour. So it seemed like the government felt like it had to move on it, albeit it's been a really slow U-turn. But it does also strike me now that there's a couple of potential risks with this. I guess the first one is, will the government now get the credit for doing what it's done now? Will it sort of, the people that will now get this winter fuel payment come this winter, will it be a case of, all is forgiven, we've got our winter fuel payment back, thank you very much, we're glad that the government kind of recognised that it was in a place on this that most people, or a lot of people, it's not fair to say most people, but the feedback was that a lot of people weren't brilliantly happy about it, or not. And the other bit of this is, what about Rachel Reeves? Because, this was one of the first early things that she did as Chancellor, somebody who had made very clear that she wanted to be seen as a sort of safe pair of hands and a safe custodian of the public finances. And this was one of the decisions that she had pointed to as her taking, in her words, the difficult decisions that were necessary at the time. So now she's moved on such an important decision of this. What does that mean for the Chancellor?
It's really interesting, isn't it? Because, you listen to all of the Chancellor's critics, and my goodness, there's been this sort of unified chorus stretching from Unite the Union to Reform UK and taking in the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats and plenty of others, effectively saying today, I told you so. So politics is a rough old business. Even when you do what your opponents want you to do, they then try and claim the credit rather than giving it to you when you change your mind. Now, as I say, Rachel Reeves makes this argument that she felt that she had to act last summer. I think what perhaps caught them by surprise, even if you take that at face value, is the scale of the response. And in other words, they were getting far more heat for this than the value it brought them in terms of the spreadsheets. So yes, it was saving money. Yes, it was saving money in year, but they took colossal heat from the minute the announcement came. It sat on the political news agenda like a giant toad all summer when Labour MPs new to Westminster, they'd been used to fighting an unpopular Conservative government for the last couple of years, and suddenly it's their inboxes that are being deluged with people saying, this is dreadful, what are you all about, you didn't tell us this in advance, yada, yada, yada. Targeting a chunk of the population who have got a far higher likelihood of voting than pretty much everyone else, and can sure as heck make an argument when they think they've been badly done to. And it never went away. As you say, it came up on the doorsteps in the local elections in England and in that by-election. We've then seen this sort of long arc of a U-turn. And then there's the kind of psychology of a U-turn. And I don't think there's an obvious answer to this, really. Are you better to dig in with something that's unpopular and say, no, it might be unpopular, but we've done it for this reason, we're sticking to it? Or is it better to change your mind? I think people who are intensely interested in politics are more likely to be of the, gosh, do they know what they're doing? Is this a bit of a mess? Others might just be really glad to get the money back and be irritated that it was taken away for a year, but just really glad that it'll be coming back this year and in subsequent years. I suppose the interesting question that we might only discover when we read the memoirs of the likes of Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer in years to come is the extent to which they wish they'd never taken the decision in the first place. Now, that is different from thinking in and of the moment that you had to, because maybe you come to a view with hindsight that you maybe didn't need to, and or you underestimated just how much the backlash would cost you. Critics say it's been the sort of biggest debacle of Labour's first year in office. You can see why that argument is made. And I think the hit, as I say, the key thing I think here, Alex, that I take away is the political hit they have taken for it is wildly disproportionate to the amount of money that it saved. You can have an argument about whether that money had to be saved, but the hit has been significant. And then when you do U-turns, you do take a bit of a hit from people saying, gosh, do you really know what you're doing? What might come next?
And on the what might comes next, it leaves a sort of interesting question, because this isn't the only policy area that the government's been under pressure about from its own backbenchers. So, of course, we know the feedback about the winter fuel payment from some quarters of the Labour Party was pretty clear. But there are also other things like the two-child benefit cap, which the government has said that it's looking at, pointing to its child poverty strategy in the autumn, but hasn't made a clear decision on. And then, of course, the welfare reforms that are coming down the line pretty quickly, where a lot of Labour backbenchers have expressed privately and publicly their unhappiness about the cuts to welfare payments, particularly for some people that claim disability benefits. And you sort of wonder, to your point, Chris, about the psychology of a U-turn. Does this, now that the government have budged on winter fuel, does that say to those Labour backbenchers that expressed unhappiness about the winter fuel payment, are they now going, great, we're glad the government's moved on that, we accept that, we're happier? Or does it sort of embolden them, those who want the government to take a look at some of these other policy areas, to press a bit harder because they see the government has the capacity to move now?
Yeah, and again, I think we're back to psychology versus spreadsheets, because on the one hand, if you are a critic, an internal Labour critic, who perhaps wanted this change to the winter fuel payments and do want to see a change either to the proposed benefits cuts or to the two-child benefit cap, you may feel emboldened because you think this is a government that is willing to change its mind / listen / U-turn, pick your description of choice depending on your view about them. Equally, from Rachel Reeves' perspective, arguably the scope to move is now narrower, because you've just spent a huge amount of money doing something that until fairly recently you hadn't anticipated doing. This is something that's going to cost £1.25 billion. So, which is a not insignificant amount of money, which might mean that those who are then knocking on your door saying, what about this, what about that? You're thinking, well, things are even tighter than they were already. They've got to work out between now and the autumn how they're going to pay for this, at what opportunity cost. The other thing I would throw in, which is a more long-term thing, but I just think it's worth, I think newscasters will be interested in this, because I just think it's an issue that will confront a government at some point. The whole business of the so-called triple lock, this idea that the state pension goes up by the greater of inflation, earnings growth, or 2.5%. And there are those that the government is committed to. It's a manifesto commitment, and ministers have repeated that they are committed to it, to be absolutely clear. I'm talking about the medium to long term here. But you do get politicians, senior ones, saying privately, at some point, we're going to have to do something about that, because it's just unaffordable. Because the graph, because it's designed to be generous, the graph just goes towards the sky in the end, and we've already got an aging population, etc., etc., etc. But my goodness, what government would go anywhere near that, given the backlash that could provoke? This was an idea that was dreamt up at a time where pensioners were relatively poorer compared to society at large. The argument that is made now is that that's no longer the case. But gosh, any government, even in writing a manifesto about this sort of stuff or being tempted to do it between elections, would think, crikey, if the winter fuel payment could cause that much of a humdinger of a row, imagine starting messing around with the generosity of the state pension.
Quite. Chris, talking of affordability, we've got the spending review on Wednesday, when we'll find out a bit more what the government's plans are. So it's going to be a busy week for you. So we should let you crack on, because I'm pretty sure it's been a busy start to it.
Thank you, Alex. Talk to you soon.
Bye.
Cheers.
So late on Sunday night into the early hours of Monday morning, there were reports that a boat, a small yacht that was carrying aid and heading to Gaza, was intercepted by Israeli forces. Now, on this yacht were a number of people, 12 passengers, including the activist Greta Thunberg. The context to all of this is what has been happening with aid getting into Gaza. There was a long blockade by Israel of any aid getting into Gaza at all. And then we saw a new aid system, highly contentious, highly controversial, set up by Israel and the US, but with lots of warnings from international humanitarian groups about the situation on the ground in Gaza. We can talk about all of this with Jeremy Bowen, our international editor. Hello, Jeremy.
Hello.
So before we get into the details of what happened with Greta Thunberg and this boat, could you just bring us up to speed with what is the latest when it comes to aid in Gaza?
Well, the so-called Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which is this new way of doing things, sponsored by, well, set up by the Israelis and the Americans, what the UN calls a militarized form of aid. They're claiming they're making gigantic inroads, that delivered and distributed the ingredients for, I think, around 10 million meals, including something like 1 million in the last few days. Of course, at the same time, there has been massive loss of life among those tens of thousands of Palestinians who flocked to the sites where the aid has been. The UN is not taking part in this process, along with the leading humanitarian agencies like the International Red Cross, because they say that this does not correspond with humanitarian values, that it's not going to work, that their system is better, and that essentially it's more about the politics of the conflict than aid.
And when you talk about those international organisations, so we heard, for example, from the UN's human rights chief, Volker Turk, last week saying that Palestinians had the grimmest of choices, die from starvation or risk being killed while trying to access the food being made available. I was struck by a piece you've written on the BBC News website on the basis of an interview you did with the head of the International Committee of the Red Cross. Again, when she was talking about the situation on the ground in Gaza, is there any evidence this week that anything has changed?
No, there's been killing there again today, and this time it appears to have come. The people pulling the triggers have not been, on this occasion, the Israelis. The reports coming out of the area near Rafah are that the shooting is being done by a Palestinian militia, and in the last few days, it has emerged from leaks inside from Israeli politicians that the Israelis have been cooperating with a group that are seen by many in Gaza as being implicated in criminal activities there, including robbing UN convoys when they were operating, and that they are cooperating with this militia. The militia itself denies being armed by the Israelis, but they certainly have been operating quite openly without being hit by Israel. So clearly it's clear that they are talking to each other and they are cooperating closely. So the reports coming out were absolutely horrendous this morning, saying that these militias were shooting on some of the thousands of people who were trying to get close to the site. It isn't clear why they would be doing that, but having seen the information coming out of the field hospitals in the area and being in contact with a few of them, they are once again taking in large numbers of casualties, and with multiple gunshot wounds.
So that is what we are hearing that's coming out of Gaza. And then you've got this situation where there's this yacht with Greta Thunberg, a total of 12 people on it, other activists. There was a French member of the European Parliament. There was a French journalist with Al Jazeera. And they had on board this yacht some aid that they were attempting to take to Gaza when they were intercepted by Israeli forces. What do we know about what happened?
Well, I mean, this expedition, including Greta Thunberg on this rather nice looking yacht, the Madeleine, which was not a massive yacht, and it's got a mast and sails, and it's been going steadily across the Mediterranean, publicizing itself because, it's an act of protest. There are activists on board. It's a political act. They're carrying purely symbolic, they'd be the first to say it themselves, purely symbolic amounts of aid. And they were hoping to get through and somehow break the siege of Gaza by landing on the beach there. Now, I think they probably always knew that they'd be picked up by the Israelis. The Israelis would not have let that happen. Now, it was a sort of recreation of something that happened back in 2010, when that was a period when there were those few years around that period, there were several wars between Israel and Hamas. I reported on all of them, and they, at the time, we thought they in terms of the impact, humanitarian impact on Gaza, we thought it was, extraordinarily harsh with several thousand people dead. But of course, it's nothing compared to what's been happening in the last 20 months in terms of the humanitarian impact. And so back then, this boat, this was a Turkish vessel, much bigger one, the Mavi Marmara, was boarded by Israeli naval commandos. They killed, I think, 9 people on board. And it caused a huge incident between Israel and Turkey. I went to the funerals actually in Istanbul of quite a few of the people who were killed on board there. There were massive crowds. So it was, I think, on this occasion, the Israelis have thought things out. And they very quickly said that none of the crew have been hurt, and they're taking them. They took them back into Israel. So I mean, I think the Israelis are suggesting, they're calling it things like the selfie vessel, the selfie ship. They're suggesting that they've basically flummoxed a stunt. And I imagine that the Greta Thunberg side of things are saying, look, people are talking about the situation, and in a sense, we've made our point.
Because they put out video that sort of emerged from what seemed to be the moment that the Israeli forces boarded this boat. But then there were a series of videos from some of the passengers on the boat as well. I think we can have a listen to one of them that comes from Greta Thunberg. Here it is.
I urge all my friends, family and comrades to put pressure on the Swedish government to release me and the others as soon as possible.
That's obviously because Greta Thunberg is Swedish, of course. Do we know what is going to happen or what has happened so far to the passengers on this boat?
Well, they have been brought into Israel, as far as I understand it. I think the boat was taken under tow. They were still quite some way off the coast, and they were in international waters. So they will be saying that this was an act of piracy on the high seas, that they were picked up. I think the Israelis would say that it was an entirely legitimate operation to safeguard the coastline. And I mean, the protesters on the yacht were making the point that they weren't interested in entering Israeli territorial waters. They wanted to enter the territorial waters of Gaza. And they also referred back to the advisory judgment made by the International Court of Justice. So not binding, but considered very influential, that was made last year, that said that the entire occupation of the Palestinian territories was illegal under international law. So the argument that people extrapolate from that, lawyers as well as activists, is that Israel has no authority to pick them up if they were heading towards Gaza. Now, of course, the de facto reality of what's going on is that there are wars going on there, and Israel is fighting it, and there was no way they were going to let these people land.
And as you say, one would assume there is every expectation of the people who are on this vessel that they were going to be intercepted. And perhaps part of the point of this, having high profile figures like Greta Thunberg on board, was to capture attention and to, point to what is happening in Gaza. But I guess the obvious question, and perhaps the impossible question, Jeremy, is, will it make any difference?
It keeps people look, we're talking about it. I think what really will make the difference is if one day President Trump wakes up and thinks enough is enough, and he gets hold of Netanyahu and he says, you know what, the money's going to stop, the weapons are going to stop, the support's going to stop unless you stop. Until then, I don't really see it happening. But, we focus quite rightly on the death toll. We focus also on Israel's justifications for doing this. They say that it's self-defense, but the lesson that I've been researching this topic extensively for a big piece I've written on the BBC website and also other parts of BBC, other bits of broadcasting, that the international law applies to every party in a war equally, and even if one party is attacked in a way that it thinks is utterly egregious and totally unacceptable and brutal, it does not give them an exemption from the provisions of law. Under law, there is a right of resistance to occupation, and there's also a right of self-defense. But both of those have to be within the law. And the argument being made, and I think just through the evidence of our own eyes, is whether or not that is Israel's response has been proportionate to the current danger that they may be in. And a lot of people are making the argument very strongly that that is not the case. But because we've been focusing on all of that, there's other stuff going on which doesn't make it through, if you like, because there's never enough time. But let me give you one statistic which really actually rocked me when I read it. In the UN humanitarian office puts a humanitarian update out every week on a Wednesday or Thursday, I think. I mean, you can go online and see these things. And one of the stats which knocked me over actually was in the last 3 months or so since Israel broke the ceasefire, something like 650,000 people inside Gaza have been displaced. In other words, they've been forced to up sticks yet again, grab whatever few belongings they've got left and try and move somewhere. 650,000 is more than the population of Manchester. So you can imagine a situation where the population of Manchester has to up sticks and move, carrying what it can. And in that period, the UN says, Israel has not allowed in any, zero, shelter materials. So these people have just have to try and grab the plastic they probably had made into a tent where they were and take it with them. They've been displaced multiple times already, but I just thought the sheer numbers of that, 650,000 people, is a massive number.
And given that we have seen a hardening of the language, the rhetoric certainly that's coming out of, for example, Canada, the UK, France, we've got this France-led conference happening in New York later on this month. Given all of that, and given what you said earlier, Jeremy, about the role of the US in all of this, do you sense that there is any shift coming out of the Trump administration? As we're having this conversation just before 4 o'clock on Monday, I've seen some reports that perhaps Netanyahu and President Trump are going to speak on Monday. But what is your sense of where the US administration is now in all of this?
Well, with the big caveat that Trump can change his mind and turn on a sixpence. If you remember, a few weeks ago, he was in the Gulf, had a very successful meeting. The Qataris gave him a very nice aircraft as a present. He did lots of supposed deal making with the Saudis, and he was welcomed in, absolutely luxurious style, all the kinds of things that he's known to like. And then there was a lot of talk because he did things like meet the new leader of Syria, and lift sanctions on Syria, things like that. There was a lot of talk, quite rightly, I think, that there was some daylight between what Netanyahu wants and what Trump wants, and also in terms of Trump wanting to talk to Iran, Netanyahu wanting to bomb Iran. So that's definite daylight there. But when it comes to Gaza, the Palestinians, the Israelis, that hasn't been borne out by the evidence. There was a UN resolution calling for an immediate ceasefire and resumption of full humanitarian aid, and the release of all the hostages last week, I think. And 14 members of the Security Council, including the UK as a permanent member, voted for it. There was one dissenting voice, the US, which used its veto to kill the resolution. So nothing new there then, because that's happened many times before. And I think that while that kind of diplomatic protection allied with continued military support continues from the Trump administration and the US to Israel, then there's no real incentive for Netanyahu to change tack in terms of pursuing the war. Britain, France, and Canada, in that, excuse me, Britain, France, and Canada, in that message they put out a few weeks ago, said that there needs to be a halt to the current Israeli offensive and unfettered access of humanitarian aid into Gaza, or they will take concrete steps. Now, there have been a few taken. Britain sanctioned, they suspended the trade talks with Israel and sanctioned a settler leader. But one of the big debates I know that within the Foreign Office is whether they should sanction the two the two ultra-extremist cabinet ministers who support Netanyahu's government, and that's Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir. And those two gentlemen who've said some very, very inflammatory things. They basically want the Palestinians out of Gaza to be replaced by Jewish settlers. They have the next step that Britain could take and it has been discussed, is sanctioning them, but that decision has not at this point been taken. And there's this conference coming up about the two-state solution and how on earth to try and revive something that looks like it's dead and buried and has been for many years. And so one thing that Britain's been discussing, and it's been open about this with the French, has been recognition of a Palestinian state, which something like, I think, 148 countries around the world have already done, including the Irish, the Spanish, and the Norwegians. But at the moment, I don't think it's going to be happening at that conference. That's certainly not as things stand at the moment. But there will be talk of it. Israel, of course, is utterly against any suggestion. And Netanyahu, when Britain, France, and Canada put out that statement saying that he needs to stop the offensive immediately, he came out with a very, very strong statement in English. So it was designed for global consumption, which essentially called it anti-Semitic. He made direct links with the terrible murders of that couple in Washington, D.C., both of whom worked for the Israeli embassy by someone who was shouting slogans in favor of the Palestinians. And he basically linked, he's saying that sort of complaint against Israel's activity equals incitement against Jews, equals anti-Semitism, and equals exposing Jews to actual harm up to and including murder. So that was his response. So it is interesting to wonder what Canada, France, and the UK are going to do next.
Exactly. And Jeremy, as you say, that conference is later on in June. I'm sure a lot of people are going to be watching it closely. But if you want to read more about it, you can read Jeremy's article that he mentioned on the in-depth section of the BBC News website. I read it this morning and I highly recommend you do the same. Jeremy, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks very much.